this will be a bit different of a talk. I'm going to today talk about human behavior and how we can try to understand how we behave on the web in some regards by looking at how we behave in other domains, in particular, how we search for things. And it's very nice to be able to follow Professor Hendler's talk because the data that I'm going to be telling you about from other people on how we search on the web is actually data largely from before 2011, and so it'll be interesting to talk about how people are going to be searching given the changes that are being made to the web to help us to be able to search. So what we're going to be focusing on, and search is something that we and other organisms spend a huge amount of our lives doing. We need to search anytime the resources that we need for survival or reproduction or for our own entertainment are distributed in space or time. If they're not all just presented to us at once for us to look through and choose amongst, then we need to engage in search for these things. And that applies to a wide range of different kinds of resources. So starting with looking for sustenance. I've spent a lot of time over the past few days here in Montreal looking for restaurants and succeeding very nicely. Looking for places to live. Looking for social partners, whether they're mates, whether they're partners for other kinds of interactions. Looking for modern kinds of goods like houses or jobs or different kinds of goods that we might want to purchase. But also, at least for humans in particular, looking for information. And that can be information that is either external to ourselves, for instance on the web, or internal in our own memories. And whenever we're, first of all, life without search would be very boring. And this is an example of an organism that does not engage in any search, but rather just sits and waits for everything that it needs to come to it. So food comes and it filters it out of the water. These are sea pens that live on the sea floor. And the gametes, the eggs and sperm from other sea pens come floating and they grab those and reproduce with those. Their life is not particularly exciting. No search, no interesting. Search has some particular challenges to it. It's not enough just to search forever. That's not what we are engaged in. We are searching, we are exploring for things and finding them and then using them, and often using them up or getting all the utility out of them, and then needing to search again to find new resources, new food, new information, etc. And so we have to constantly be engaged in this trade-off between exploration for new resources and exploitation of the resources that we find. And we need to get that balance right, because if we spend too long exploring, we're not getting and using the resources that we need. If we spend too long exploiting, then we're missing out on other potentially better resources that are still out there, especially if the ones that we are currently using, we are using up. So how this explore-exploit trade-off gets made is an ongoing process that humans and other organisms have to engage in. And we're going to talk about how we do this. I'm going to talk about how we do this in terms of, first of all, what are some optimal approaches to this kind of problem? So optimization under constraints, can we figure out what would be the best way to search for these resources if you are an organism facing a particular kind of environment? But humans and other animals themselves don't do that optimization process. Rather, we solve these kinds of complex problems through rather more simple heuristics in what we call the mind's adaptive toolbox. And so this is the notion of bounded rationality within which humans and other organisms have to actually make the decisions that we make. So adaptive toolbox is this collection in the mind of different kinds of mechanisms that we can use to make decisions. And some of them are simple heuristics, some of them are more complex reasoning strategies that we might engage in, but lots of them are these fast shortcuts. Some of them are given to us through evolution. Some are things that we figure out through our own experience or that we get taught from others. And they are often applicable to particular different tasks, so they're domain specific. We don't have one heuristic or one super powerful tool in our mind's adaptive toolbox that we apply to all different problems. Rather, we have this collection of them, different tools for different tasks. They use the particular structure of the environment, and that's part of what allows them to be simple, by relying on the fact that there are stable structures out there in the environment that we can exploit in our decision making. And that match between the structure that's out there in the world and the mental mechanisms, the structure of those that are in our heads, when they fit together, that's what we call ecological rationality. People are able to make good decisions with simple strategies. We can also be led astray if we're using the wrong strategy in the wrong situation and make bad decisions. So there's lots of work on making wrong decisions, having biased decision-making, wrongly biased decision-making as well. But by and large, our minds are designed to do well in particular appropriate environments. There's a bunch of books from our research group on this topic if you want to see more detail. The Simple Heuristics That Make Us Smart came out first, and then more recently, books specifically on ecological rationality and social rationality. But today, what we focus on is looking at how this behavior of search that people and other organisms have evolved to be good at gets applied in new situations, both internal search in memory and external search for information on the web. So how are we applying our Stone Age and earlier brain to these modern kinds of environments? And we're going to start by looking at, well, what was this original search problem that our ancestors faced in terms of looking for resources that are distributed in space? How does that get solved? And then how does that get applied to search in memory for concepts and to search for information online? The links between these different domains are going to come from application of optimal foraging theory from biology and the study of heuristics from psychology and cognitive science. And again, it's going to be interesting to talk, and probably more in the discussion this afternoon, about how our search online is changing as the structure of the web itself is changing. A lot of this work on search is captured in another recent book on cognitive search that came out of a meeting that we had in Germany on 40 different scientists from psychology, from evolutionary biology, from neuroscience, from computer science, all focused on this topic of search from a variety of different perspectives. And so there's a bunch more detail in that book there. So what animals need to do in order to solve this search problem involves multiple different subtasks. First of all, animals need to find a patch of resources if the resources that we're considering are patchy, which lots of them are, as I'll show you. That is, they need to explore for a while and find, okay, here's a set of these resources that I can now start to use. And then they need to stay in that patch, exploiting that resource until such time as it's no longer profitable to do that, or no longer more profitable than going someplace else. And so this process of having to decide when is it time to leave that patch and switch from exploiting the resource back to exploring is the third step here. We're going to focus, first of all, on this for a while and look at how people and other animals solve that aspect of the problem. So searching in patches occurs widely for a variety of different kinds of resources. Food resources come in patches, so an archetypal example would be berries on a berry bush. You've got this one patch, which is the berry bush. It's loaded with berries. You pick those for a while. You have to do a little bit of search inside that patch in order to find the berries, looking under leaves, etc. After a time, you start slowing down in how quickly you can find the berries, and at some point you decide, I'm not finding enough here, time to leave this patch, move on, find another patch, another berry bush which may be around the hill, and then exploit that one. So switching between exploiting, exploring, and exploiting. Other organisms do this for different kinds of resources. Like these wasps are looking for, not for food for themselves, but for food for their babies. They're looking for sites to lay their eggs in terms of little caterpillars. And they find a patch of caterpillars and they lay a bunch of eggs in those, and various gross things happen after the eggs hatch. But that is searching for a different kind of resource. And then on the web, looking for information. As I'll show you, there's data indicating that the way information is structured on the web is also patchy. So that the same kinds of mechanisms we're talking about here for biological search domains can apply to web search as well. So again, a patch is this locally dense area of resources separated by some empty, more or less empty space, and then there's other patches elsewhere in the space. And as the organism exploits these kinds of patches, they get used up, depleted. And so at some point, the organism has to decide, should I keep on staying in this particular patch, trying to exploit what may be left there, although I'm not finding stuff very quickly, or should I move on and try and find another patch which hopefully will have more stuff that I'll be able to get out more quickly. So that's the task that is faced by organisms, including humans, in patch leaving. So what's optimal in this kind of problem? Well, very simply, it is you want to leave the patch as soon as your rate of resource finding in the current patch is worse than what you could do by exploring and going and finding another patch. That is, there's this mean rate of return overall in the environment as you spend your life exploring, exploiting, exploring, exploiting. You can look at, here's what the mean rate of resource return is over time. When you're in a given patch, you start off with a high mean rate of return, or high instantaneous rate of return rather, within that patch. There's lots of stuff, you're finding lots of berries quickly, but then you've found a lot of the berries, there aren't as many left to find, the rate of return starts to fall, and at some point the rate of return in that patch is going to fall below your mean rate of return overall in the environment, and that's the time to leave that patch and go find a new patch. And that's summed up in the marginal value theorem by Chernoff from a number of years ago. So leave when the instantaneous rate of return in the current patch falls below the mean rate of return in the environment. There's various reasons why this is complicated for an individual organism to figure out. What exactly is their mean rate of return? What exactly is the instantaneous rate of return in the current environment? And so individuals tend to use some simple heuristics or rules of thumb for approximating this decision, for figuring out when to leave a patch. For instance, some species of birds, like this chickadee, will have a particular kind of decision mechanism for deciding when to leave a patch that is referred to as following a giving up time. The way that goes is illustrated here. So we have how long the bird has been in a patch. It comes, it lands at a patch, and it starts foraging, and this is how long it's been on the patch. And on the y-axis is its internal tendency to stay in that patch, which starts off pretty high. It finds a new patch, it has a pretty high tendency to stay. But over time, that tendency to stay falls, and at some point it's going to leave the patch as soon as it falls down to this level. But every time that it finds a new resource, so a grub to eat, for instance, which are represented by these X's, its tendency to stay in the patch gets reset up to that initial level. And then it starts to fall again. Finds another grub, it gets reset, starts to fall again. Finds another grub, gets reset. And then it doesn't find a grub in enough time before its tendency to stay in the patch falls to this threshold and it ultimately leaves. So we can represent that as this giving up time. If it's been this long since I last found something in this patch, then it's time to leave the patch. And that very simple rule, all you need is a timer, can do a very good job of fulfilling or meeting the optimal marginal value theorem in particular kinds of environments, particular ways that the sizes of the patches are distributed. So we wanted to look at whether people would follow these kinds of rules when they are facing these kind of patch-leaving decisions. And we wanted to see whether people would do that in the same or different ways when they're doing an external search for resources out in the world and an internal search for information that's in their mind. So we set up a couple of tasks that we tried to make as analogous as possible to represent external search, a fishing task, I'll go through that in a second, and then an internal search, which is a word puzzle task, sort of like Scrabble, and I'll show you more details on that, to see how people are deciding when to leave these patches. So in the fishing task, basically we had subjects come into the lab. They faced a computer screen. I'll just show you what that looks like here. And they were controlling this little fisher guy. And you would come to a pond. Here's a new pond. And in this pond, there were some number of fish, which the subject didn't know. And every once in a while, one of those fish would appear on the surface of the pond. All that the subject had to do was to move their hook over to where that fish was, and they would catch the fish. So they just had to watch, wait for the fish, catch them. But the more fish that they took out of the pond, the fewer fish there were left in the pond, and so the longer it took for successive fish to appear. And so at some point, each person had to decide, I don't think I'm going to find any more fish in here, or at least not quickly enough to stay. Time to leave and go on to the next pond. And then they would click at that moment on this button down here, which says new pond in German, because we were running this study in Germany. And then there would be a little delay. Their guy would walk off the screen and then walk back on the screen to a new pond, and they would repeat this process. And they would do that for about an hour. And their goal was to catch as many fish as they could within that time. And they would get paid for how many fish they caught. And so they had to balance how long are they going to stay in a given pond versus how quickly are they going to leave and explore and find the next pond. And there is this delay between the ponds, so it's not a viable strategy to catch one fish, go to the next pond, catch another fish, go to the next pond, because there's this delay in between the travel time or exploring time. Okay? For the internal task, we wanted people to have to sort of catch their prey in their mind. And so we set up a task where people were basically playing a Scrabble-like game. And that looked like this. We would give them a set of random letters, and they had to type words that they could make out of those random letters without repeats and without adding any other letters. Again, this is all in German. If they entered something that was a real word, then they would get the green light and it would appear in their list of words that they had caught in this patch, or they would get feedback that, no, you did something wrong, type in another word. And so they would sit there and they would think of words that they could make out of these letters and type them in, and the first few come pretty quickly, and then they start to slow down, a few more, slow down further, longer time in between each successive word, until at some point they decide, I can't think of any more words quickly enough here, time to move on to the next patch, the next sequence, and they would hit that button. Okay, so an analogous task to the fishing task, but in this case looking for things in your memory, namely particular words that you can make out of this letter set. So now we want to see how are people deciding when to switch in those two kinds of patch-leaving tasks. And this is a representation of the kind of data that we get for a bunch of different subjects. We zoom in on one of them, and we have here time, and up here number of items that have been caught or found. And each of these blue trajectories shows a particular patch. So one person did all of these patches. Each of the blue lines shows their trajectory within one patch. They go along and they find something, go along, find something else, go along, find something else, whether it's a fish or a word. And at some point, they switch to another patch, and that's those black stars at the end. Okay? And so we can look at the pattern now just showing those black stars, the points at which they switched, and see which of various different heuristic strategies best explain how they were deciding when to switch. And I'm not going to go into big detail on that, but basically what people were doing, we first of all, up on the top, calculated what would be the optimal strategy, the optimal pattern for where those switching points would happen over time. And in the bottom graph we show the patterns that people actually followed for their switching patterns. And these patterns that they were following most closely matched that kind of giving up time rule, which is this one here. So people in both of those kinds of environments, both external environments and internal environments, were waiting until it had been too long since the last item that they had found and deciding to switch then. And they were coming close to the optimal strategy by doing that. That's what this says. So people's patch-leaving strategies were following the marginal value theorem and were allowing them to come close to the optimal trade-off between exploring and exploiting. What was interesting here was that this happened both for the kind of food-oriented external search, the fishing task, and for the internal search for information in memory. The thing was that information in memory, we were kind of giving them the patches. We were saying, here is this set of letters, now what can you construct from that? And that's not quite the same as saying, how is your information structured in your head? What concepts do you have close to what other concepts, and how would you search through those concepts in mind? And so we developed another task to specifically look at that. Look at whether or not when people are thinking of ideas and trying to come up with a bunch of ideas, how long do we focus on one patch of ideas in our heads before we move on and look for another patch of ideas? And would we do this in a way that, again, follows the predictions from optimal foraging theory of the marginal value theorem? The task that we use that is another common psychology task called the verbal fluency task. And the way that works is that I ask you to come up with all of the animals that you can think of in 3 minutes. So what's the first animal you can think of? Dog. All right. It's working. What's the next animal? All right. So that's what absolutely everybody says, at least in English. I was interested if it would be different in French.
Honey badger.
Sorry?
Honey badger.
Honey badger would be the first from whatever weird culture you're from. Okay. Really? Wow. Okay. It also depends what else you've been thinking about earlier this morning. Most people do say dog and cat, and then they go on to say other things that are usually like pets. So might come up with guinea pig, maybe hamster, maybe parakeet, and then they sort of slow down and can't think of any more pets. And so then they switch to, farm animals, goat, and then chicken, and then horse and cow and duck, and then slow down, and then think of another patch, sea animals, so fish and dolphin and whale. And so you get bursts of information. Oh, and this reminds me to mention the connection also to Professor Matter's talk yesterday on bursts and cascades, that those cascades, those bursts that he was talking about are another representation or piece of evidence that there are patches underlying something, that you find a bunch of stuff quickly in a burst, and then there's a lull, and then there's another burst. That's a sign that we're talking about patches. And so that's exactly what we see in the verbal fluency tests, that people come up with these concepts. And this applies to animals, it applies to if you ask people for foods, if you ask people for cities, if you ask people for occupations, all different kinds of semantic concepts people will come up with in these bursts, these patches. And so we can look at not only what are the things people are telling us, but also how long is it between each successive item, these inter-item retrieval times, the IRTs, as it says there. And what we want to look at in the data is whether or not longer IRTs represent the times at which people are switching from one patch to another, as I presented it here. And then the question of whether or not people are doing that, are switching between these patches, again, in a roughly optimal way. So in a way that would be predicted by the theory that comes from search in spatial environments. These are what the inter-item retrieval times look like from this kind of task over time. So here's time, here's how long it takes between successive items, and you see you get a bunch of items pretty quick, and then there's a spike, and then a few more pretty quick, and then another long spike, indicating that people at least have a pause between these items every once in a while. And if we look at what is happening between the successive items around these spikes, they are indeed locations where people are switching from one kind of semantic patch to another kind of semantic patch. So from pets to sea animals, for instance. And so, as I said, we wanted to look to see whether or not people are timing those patch switches in an appropriate way, making an optimal kind of decision of now I'm running out of things in this patch, time to move on to another patch. And as I'll show you on the next slide, the answer that we found was indeed yes. What we don't yet know is what are the simple rules that people are using to make that decision, although it looks like they're also related to these giving up time kinds of rules. So the way that we see that happening in the data, this slightly complex graph, we have here different transitions between successive items, and these are all transitions within one patch. These are all transitions within the next patch, and this from here to here is a transition from one patch to the next patch, okay? So each of these things is how long does it take to go from the fourth previous word in the first patch to the third previous word, and from the third previous word to the second previous word, and so on. So these are those inter-item retrieval times between successive words as we finish up one patch and then get to a new patch. And this, again, is how long it takes to go from the previous patch to the new patch, and then how long it takes us to find each successive word within that next patch. And what we have graphed here with the dashed line is what is the overall mean rate, mean inter-item retrieval time from subjects, which is the inverse of the rate at which they are finding things. And what we see from this graph is that as long as people are producing items faster than that mean inter-item retrieval time, they're doing pretty good. They're doing better than they could if they left and went to another patch, and so they stay in that patch. And it's only when their inter-item retrieval time rises higher than that mean overall time that they say this is taking too long, time to move on and find another patch. And once they're in that next patch, then their speed of finding things falls again, starts to rise slowly until the next too long time, and they switch to another patch. So this is, again, fitting with exactly that marginal value theorem. So people are searching in purely internal semantic memory patches in a way that matches how we are searching in external space as well. That's exactly what that says, and as I mentioned, what we don't have the complete story on yet is what are the strategies that people are using to make that decision. Are they just looking at how long it's been since the last word? Are they looking at how long it's been over the last few words? Are they counting up the number of words that they found in a given patch, which is another kind of strategy that could approximate the optimal strategy as well? That's still something to be looked at. One of the ways we're going to be looking at that and seeing whether or not people are really doing this switching between exploring within one patch and then between exploiting within one patch and then switching to exploring to find a new patch and then switching back to exploiting within one patch is by having people do this in an MRI scanner, because there are good indications of when people are engaging a switching process. And so if we can see that people are using those areas of the brain that have been identified as doing task switching, that will help us to tell, yes, this is indeed the way people are doing this kind of search, switching explicitly between exploring and exploiting. If not, there are other possibilities. They may just be hopping around with smaller and bigger steps on a semantic network, so not ever explicitly switching between exploring and exploiting, just moving around at random, which occasionally will take them to a new patch. So that's one of the alternate theories that we're going to be trying to distinguish against with this kind of data. Okay. When are we going to this time? 15 minutes. Okay, good. No? Yes? Okay. So we have done another piece of work. This is with Rob Goldstone and Thomas Hills, who was a postdoc working with us and now at University of Warwick, on whether or not the same kinds of mechanisms are being used when people do both internal and external search. What I've shown you so far is that behaviorally they look the same, but we did a further study to look to see whether or not there would be priming between those two different kinds of search. That is to say, if people were searching in a patchy spatial environment, would that, in which they were spending a lot of time exploiting given patches, would that then subsequently influence the way that they were searching within their minds? Would they exploit patches in their minds longer as well? And this is what we looked at by combining a spatial task with a mental search task. So we had everybody do a SCRABBLE-like mental search task. Then we had everybody do a spatial task, but half of the people did a foraging task where the resources were spread out evenly in a diffuse manner. The other half did a foraging task where the resources were clumped in space, so they'd have to spend time exploiting patches. Over here, all they have to do is explore. And then we had everybody do the SCRABBLE task again, and we compared how long were they exploiting each patch the second time they did the SCRABBLE task versus the first time they did the SCRABBLE task. Did this intervening spatial task affect how much time they spent exploiting, this trade-off between exploring and exploiting that they were making? Okay. So the way that the spatial task worked in this case, it wasn't a fishing pond, but rather there were resources spread out in space. They had a little spaceship that they could fly around, and somewhere in here there's resources. And whenever they passed over a resource, then their spaceship turned red, so they knew, okay, I've found a resource. So here they're zooming around, don't find anything, oh, there's stuff. And so now they stay in that area, they're exploiting this patch, trying to get all the resources in that area. And so the underlying structure of the the resources in the clumpy spatial environment look like this. We got clumps. We have patches that people have to find. In the diffuse one, same number of resources overall, but just spread evenly through the environment. And so search paths in those two different environments look like this. Here we have exploring and then finding patch and exploiting, and then exploring again and exploiting, and we see that in these other ones as well. Whereas in the diffuse environments, all that people are doing is exploring. Okay? And we had people do this, the internal memory search task, and again, it's coming up with words out of a set of random letters. And what we wanted to find is how long are they spending in each of these patches, depending on whether or not they had been in a patchy spatial environment or a diffuse spatial environment. And what we found was, indeed, that when people were in a clumpy, patchy spatial environment, they spent longer. This is now comparing the time exploiting each of the word patches before versus after. They spent longer after exploiting clumpy environments than after exploring in a diffuse spatial environment. So this is priming from the spatial search to the mental search, suggesting that it could be the exact same mechanisms that are being used for both of those. Okay. All right, and now we're going to get to the information search online and see whether similar kinds of processes are being used by people there. So George Miller has talked about humans as being informers, and Pirolli Card, in particular Peter Pirolli, who's pushed the idea in terms of foraging for information on the web and elsewhere, talks about information foraging theory as a direct extension of optimal foraging theory for animals looking for food. That implies that people should look for information patches, and in particular on the web we'll be focusing on, in efficient ways, so finding them as quickly as they can, and also giving up on the patches when it's appropriate or optimal to do so. That is, if you're in an information patch and it's not producing enough stuff for you, then leave that patch and move on. Information is a little bit different from food in that we're not just looking for any old information out there, any old sustenance, where it's often targeted, so it's answers to specific kinds of queries, like what are the latest promising drugs against cancer. So often we are doing search, information search on the web in terms of those kinds of queries. The question that we first have to look at is whether or not the information on the web is patchy, in order to know whether the theory that has been developed within optimal foraging theory for foraging in patchy environments will apply online as well. And people have looked at the structure of information on the web to see whether or not it is patchy in a couple of different ways. So Bernardo Huberman and others have found that information on the web looks like it is patchy in that there's similar information near to a given page that you're on, in terms of near, in terms of not very many links away. So if we look at the similarity of information between pages that are linked to each other, it's around, or at least when this was done, correlation similarities of around 0.23. Sibling pages, which are, that is, both children of one common page, also have high similarity, but random pairs of pages have almost no similarity. And so that is one kind of indication that similar information is going to be nearby, meaning that information can be considered patchy on the web. The same thing is seen here. So this again is the correlations between pages that are one link apart or 2 links apart or 3 links apart. So we see a very quick fall off in terms of how much information overlap there is between linked pages once we go beyond a couple of links away. So another indication that information seems to be patchy on the web. So then, given that it's patchy, the next problem is to find patches of the information that you are looking for. Are there cues out there that people can follow to find the kinds of information that they're looking for? And of course, there are. So that is things like short description of pages that you could jump to. And these short descriptions contain words that can help you figure out whether or not this particular page that I might choose to go to has some information relevant for the query that I'm exploring. And also on links themselves in a given web page, there's a few words that tell us something about where we would be taken to if we followed that link, about what kind of information is going to be on there. So those are some cues that could be followed to find the information that we seek. And Pirolli has characterized this as an information scent. Those cues can be used to figure out, in an analogy to the smell of food patches, whether or not this is a direction to go in order to find the kind of information that we want. And the way that this gets determined is by looking at the particular query that somebody has that's going to have certain terms in it, and the particular cues, those words that are on there, on describing the link that you could follow, and seeing what are the association strengths between those two sets of terms. And so that can be characterized like this. So if we have a particular query, for instance, latest medical treatments against cancer, then here are the important terms in that query. And then we're looking at a particular description of a web page that we could jump to, and we see these words in the description of that page. To figure out the information scent of this page for this query, we look at what association strengths between all of those terms and add that all up to figure out, okay, here's how strongly this particular page smells of the kind of information that I'm looking for in answer to this query. So that's just a way of all the activation strengths. And this comes from John Anderson's ACT-R models of spreading activation. So what people are going to be doing, given that the web is and that it's smelly, is first of all looking for patches by following the information scent that leads them in that direction. And when they're in a patch, stay in it as long as it's profitable and leave it when it no longer looks profitable. And that has been modeled by Pirolli and Wei-Tat Fu in a couple of models that are called SNIF-ACT. So that's scent-based navigation and information foraging in ACT, ACT-R theory from John Anderson. And that, in those models, it instantiates a couple of particular kinds of behaviors. First of all, looking for pages that have a particular information scent matching the current information goal, the current query, and then leaving the patches that are no longer meeting that goal. And the way that a patch is left is that we leave a particular patch after some time if the utility of being in that patch is less than the opportunity cost. That means the reward that we could get by searching elsewhere. So as soon as the reward from this current patch falls below that mean reward we could get by searching elsewhere, for instance, by going back and doing another Google search and getting a bunch more pages that we could possibly explore, that's when it's time to leave. And that is the equivalent of the marginal value theorem from optimal foraging theory, and that's where it comes from. Then Pirolli and Fu collected data to see whether or not people are actually behaving in this way as their SNIF-ACT model predicts. First of all, they wanted to see whether or not people go to the pages, if they have a list of links that they could follow, say, that have been returned from Google for a particular query, do people go to those links that have the highest information scent? So they looked at the rank order of the pages that people would actually click on for pursuing a particular query in terms of their information sent. And this is the data that they got. So here's the rank of each of these different links that are on returned from a Google search in terms of their information sent. And here is how often people chose to click on those particular pages. And we see that people are predominantly picking on or clicking on those pages that have the highest information sent. So people are following those information sent trails on the web as you would hopefully expect. So then the next question is, are people leaving patches on the web in ways that match the marginal value theorem? And in order to do that, we look at what is the information sent of a succession of pages that people are clicking on up until the point when they leave a patch, when they return to doing an overall web search. And so here we see the clicks that people make in order up until the last click when they're leaving a particular site. And here is the information sent of that page. And here we have the overall information sent of the entire search process. And what we see is that as long as the information sent is above that mean information sent, people are staying in that patch on that site. And as soon as it falls below that mean, meaning they could do better if they went elsewhere, that's when people do leave the site. So people are switching away from websites here in the same way that people are leaving mental patches, in the same way that we're leaving spatial patches, as soon as we can do better by going someplace else. So this is further evidence that we are indeed using our Stone Age evolved minds that were evolved to search for physical resources out in space, in the same way to navigate patches of information that we find both internally and on the web. And again, what I would like to discuss further later on and in person is whether or not these patterns that have been found, so the data I was just showing you from Pirolli are from before 2011. And so it's an open, interesting question. How do the changes in the structure of the web change how people are searching on the web? Can we still see evidence of our evolved psychology influencing the way that we're searching there? I'll stop there and take questions. Thanks.